thank you very much for that introduction. And as you've heard, I'm a Scot in British politics, and I'm looking, no one's putting their earphones on, so my accent must be okay. But normally when I am introduced, not only do people forget my job title, because in Britain, unlike in Germany, we change our job titles in politics every year, in that there's a sense that you've done a year in a job, quite often you're reshuffled and moved on. But the thing that people most mention to me, and most mention about me when they introduce me, but it hasn't happened today, is the high point of my political career, which is that I'm captain of the House of Commons football team. Well, wait till you hear the end of this story before you applaud. My captaincy, we've played 16 different matches against all sorts of different teams. And on those 16 matches when I've been captain, we've been great, very consistent. We've drawn none of our games. We have won none of our games, and we've lost all of the others. And when you consider one of the games that the members of the House of Commons played was against the House of Lords, you realise just how bad we are. So whenever there's a vote in the House of Commons about the House of Lords, should we elect it? Should it be a mix of elections or whatever? I always vote to abolish it. And it's got nothing to do with democracy. It's because I'm perpetually embarrassed by always losing to them on the football field. Anyway, so you didn't talk about that today. So in Scotland, I'm not going to talk about Scotland except to say this, is that so much of politics in the United Kingdom, as across the European Union, as elsewhere in the world, is about the politics of identity, the politics of value, the politics of belonging, the sense of who you are. And we had a very pleasant dinner last night, and the people I was sitting next to, I asked them to rank what's their politics of identity. And some said the politics of identity was around the city that they were from, or the region that they were from. And Germany was actually third, Europe fourth. Others felt Europe first. So in Scotland, as across the rest of the United Kingdom, this politics of identity and the politics of what I would describe as, and I don't mean this in a negative way, the politics of cultural conceit is a big driver of electoral behaviour, and it's going to be for the rest of my lifetime. And we can talk about that if you wish, but that's not what I'm here to talk about. So, ladies and gentlemen, it's lovely to be here. Thank you for the invitation, Lady Darndorf. It's lovely that you're here as well. Delighted to follow, of course, such a thoughtful speech by the Minister, which you'll know I don't agree with every part of it. But over the tea break earlier, I bumped into Jürgen Koch, who asked me, am I going to make a speech in defence of Europe? And I thought, well, actually, almost. I'm going to make a speech not in defence of Europe, but defence in Europe as the Shadow Secretary of State for Defence. And those are different things, of course. And I think my contention is that there's been a quiet crisis of confidence which predates the financial crisis about the European Union and European Union member states' role in the world stage. Perhaps for some it's been proven by the Libyan crisis. But not only do we live at a history-making point in terms of the single currency and much else besides, but we also live at an important moment for European defence policy, and I wish to talk about that today. Particularly now that the conflict in Libya comes to an end, those of us who committed forces, those forces are coming home. Well, in Afghanistan, NATO forces are trying to find the correct balance between enforcement and transition. And we have a timetable, but we don't yet have certainty to say that progress is irreversible. Closer to home across Europe, as the Minister said, there are major new threats that we face, from terrorism to climate change to nuclear proliferation to cyber attack, all of which will require new answers, new technologies, greater cooperation, and bolder preventative action. Defence is becoming more expensive, more complicated, more intricate, and much more unpredictable. But we know, as the Minister has said, that we live in a global era. And in the UK, as across the rest of the world, we must come to a realisation that on this, there is absolutely no opt-out at all. The problems we face are shared, and many of the solutions, therefore, also need to be collective. The events that we have witnessed recently in the Eurozone and the EU have made us all aware of both our interdependence and the unpredictability of a world in which events in 2011 make it almost impossible to plan with certainty what will happen in 2012. And then amidst this transformative security landscape, there are, I want to argue today, two new issues facing Europe which will shape defence policy profoundly. One is political will, and the other is economic reality. Europe's ability to protect individual nations' sovereignty and our collective security, as well as promote and protect the values and interests that we hold dear, depend both on commitment and ability to act. So the dual challenges of falling political will and challenging economic reality are threats both to that necessary commitment and our ability. So today I want to argue that greater cooperation between European countries on defence can help overcome some of these challenges. I also, in my observations, want to offer, I hope what you accept, is the aggregate or settled view of political thinking of those in the UK who are both instinctively and intellectually pro-European. As a former Europe Minister in the Labour government, that's the political terrain that I occupy. Timothy Garton-Ash at a dinner last night said that he wished to pose one provocative question, and he did. In my comments, I'm going to pose three questions. It's for you to decide whether they're provocative or not. So these common threats that I've spoken about require common action and shared operations, which are increasingly commonplace, as we know. European nations working together in the Balkans, in Chad, Afghanistan, and around the world in EU, UN, and NATO missions. We have joint objectives and standards, priorities, and also interests. But there are three key political challenges which could undermine our ability to continue to maximise this approach. First is that the current political and economic turmoil in Europe undermines calls for greater multilateralism in some populations. To argue for greater cooperation on defence at this moment is difficult, but essential. The financial crisis has ushered in, I think, a protectionist sentiment that will shape national identities, not just economic policy, and are arguably at a time when nations are more reliant than ever before on each other for national security. Secondly, many of our publics are wary and many of our publics are weary. There is widespread public reticence towards international expeditionary action. Mixed and impatient European public opinion towards Libya demonstrated this. No Allied combat casualties and a lack of collateral damage from what has been termed a new model of intervention may help persuade some publics of our ability to act and the value of doing so. But multilateralist proactive action will be hampered by public scepticism and reserve arising from recent experiences of overseas conflicts. I worry that a consequence of Afghanistan, combined with the legacy of Iraq, will be to make a constantly, permanently unpopular idea, with nations becoming increasingly ambivalent about acting on their responsibilities beyond their own borders. In such a state of ambivalence, we still believe in the same values. We just may not be readily stand up for them. The principal danger would be that the drivers of potential conflict would proceed unabated. And we must, I believe, make the case, therefore, for the duty to act beyond our own borders. In making that case, we must be aware of false distinctions. I'm aware of it particularly in the United Kingdom. The current divide in the debate on defence that distinguishes between pro-Europeanism and Atlanticism is unsustainable and unsuited to modern times. For many on the Eurosceptic right of politics in the United Kingdom, Atlanticism has become synonymous with a self-defeating, virulent Euroscepticism that is bad for Britain. It is intellectually lazy to force our country into a binary choice of Europe or America. In truth, the UK will need both if it is to be a nation that seeks to be, and Europe can be stronger through stronger ties, of course, also with the United States. The third challenge is the recognition that NATO, more so than the European Union, will be the forum through which military action is agreed and taken. But for that to be successful, a greater contribution is needed from European nations. NATO is key also to be continued support and engagement with the United States, but this depends on NATO becoming more capable, more deployable, and more balanced. At once, the Libya campaign demonstrated, I believe, each of these factors. Despite the difficulties, Libya is testament to NATO's enduring relevance. The mission was swift and so far successful. The engagement of both the UN and NATO meant the Arab League, and in particular other nations such as Qatar, were fully engaged. But it also demonstrated something else about the alliance, that just 8 of the 28 members contributed is not enough. So my first question of 3 is how does the European end of NATO take a greater share of the burden? European governments have to be more honest with each other about their capacity. There are too many never to be used battle tanks, unusable fast jets, and undeployable army conscripts. The 27 EU member states have 500,000 more men and women in uniform than the United States, but can deploy only a fraction of the capabilities that the US can. And amongst all the provocative talk of the past of coalitions of the willing, pretty infamously from George W. Bush, the act of creating coalitions of the capable may in future be a bigger challenge. This is not sustainable if we want to project power in a world where it's shifting to emerging nations and developing economies. Many, particularly over the Atlantic, have come to the conclusion that the transatlantic alliance between the European Union member states and the United States will only be more meaningful if it's more reciprocal. That means greater burden sharing. France, the UK and Germany represent 65% of all defence expenditure in NATO Europe, 88% of research and technology investment. That also means greater deployability, I think, of assets in the future. The EU spends €200 billion on defence a year, more than any other country except the US. We have 2 million Europeans in uniform, but only 5% are deployable at any one time. And yes, it also means European nations doing more to hit that NATO target on defence expenditure. But it is important to note that this debate is focusing on further cooperation is between European nations rather than the European Union. The EU is, of course, a crucial role to play in security policy in the sense civilian crisis management operations in some of the countries that I have already mentioned. The EU is involved alongside NATO and others in tackling piracy off Somalia. Yet final decisions of course and deployment of forces, amongst the biggest possible decision any government can take, will remain the decision of governments in European capitals. But I believe, in the face of an argument driven by politics of identity or political Euroscepticism or political Euroseparatism, which is an increasing pulse and a stronger pulse in the United Kingdom, I believe we can overcome much of the scepticism about wider and deeper European cooperation, but only if we confront it. If we show we have the means to respond effectively and flexibly to today's threats at a time of austerity. So let's be clear, some of the cuts to defence budgets may impact on what we can achieve overseas in the future. There are degrees, and I have argued at home in the United Kingdom, that we believe the scale and pace of the cuts to our budgets in defence are nothing short of strategic shrinkage of ambition and intent by stealth. And this is the context of austerity across Europe. Spain has cut spending on defence material by 50%, more than 50%, since 2008. Bulgarian armed forces will shrink by more than 20% over the next 4 years. The Slovenian government has proposed a further 7% cut in national defence budget. French efforts to ring-fence military funding are positive, but the mid-term review may lead to reductions, and of course there are decisions here in Germany also. European military research expenditure is on course to decrease, contrasting sharply with what's happening in Brazil, Russia, India and China. In this context of falling investment, the notion that NATO European nations consistently fight alongside one another but build their armed forces in separation from one another needs to be reconsidered. In building our forces or dismantling capability, greater European cooperation within NATO is essential. Defence procurement is critical, enabling us to maximise our ability to project force and to do so cost effectively, supporting both the front line and the bottom line. There are many things that we can do there, and the European Defence Agency is an important step. But we believe that the cooperation over procurement in an open market is the way that Europe can compete in a very expensive technology-driven activity. We also have to look at pooling force structures. As well as cooperation and procurement, we can do better to cooperate on these structures. This does not take place, not nearly to the extent which means that we maximise the real potential for frontline benefits in the future. And the excellent example is the Anglo-French model signed over the past year, which for many people is ushered in what many people are calling the entente frugale, but it is a commitment to limited interoperability, joint purchasing and sharing of expertise and facilities. This shouldn't be an isolated achievement. We hope that the Northern Group sees similar agreements emerge and that other similar groupings can assemble to discuss and take forward this agenda. Where countries can and where it is in their mutual interest, they should work together in all of these fields. This isn't about creating what many of at home our Eurosceptics call creating a Euro army, but it's pursuing gains where they can be found on a case-by-case basis. So that very briefly on the two other questions. Second one is, how do we guarantee in the future the correct balance of capability in a planned way rather than by accident? Exploring how reductions in defence expenditure and resultant changes to force and equipment structures in European nations must be better coordinated. This will be controversial for some, but European nations in NATO not only have to work together to build coalitions, as in Libya, but we must also coordinate much more effectively on defence cuts in order to prevent serious gaps in military capabilities. I observe the cuts across other countries rather than criticise them. But in light of the scale of this change taking place, it is important that we make efforts to avoid duplication as well as minimise the depth of capability shortfalls. If we accept that we will be operating in partnerships more regularly, capability reduction should be coordinated with a view to having a balanced cross-alliance equipment programme. For example, in Austria, thousands of weapon systems are being phased out. Others are getting out of the submarine business, and others are mothballing their capability on tanks. But in all of this context, it isn't all just about defence. I think often the most effective defence policy is not always about military hardware or a nation's forces or its military strategy. It can be a world-class international development policy of the type that the EU has done so much on. Investment in education, democratic reform and viable economies can hinder the spread of conflict. And the careful prevention of a world-class development policy can be so much better than the painful cure of military action. Turning to the third of my three questions. and it's the one that occupies me most. I know my time is short, so as we look ahead towards military drawdown in Afghanistan and the end of combat role at the end of 2014, there are lessons and there are consequences of Afghanistan. And when we talk about Afghanistan, lessons and consequences are different things. But my third question is this: how in European populations and European governments, European capitals, do we prevent 1.5 unpopular wars creating a permanently unpopular concept? And what I mean by that is that Iraq, undoubtedly unpopular. Afghanistan, at least partially unpopular. How do we prevent that contaminating the debate in future? On Libya in the United Kingdom, opposition to what the UK government, with our support and the opposition in the country to what was happening, and the decision to deploy was broad, worryingly broad, but thankfully shallow. But I think in the context of Afghanistan, we're talking about winning the hearts of the Afghan public. In the context of the Arab Spring, we're talking about winning the minds of the Arab street. But our prerequisite to all of that is about convincing both the logic and the emotion in Europe and our own European populations first. This argument is in the balance. I believe in a politics with responsibility beyond our own borders, beyond the borders of our own continent. But because of a combination of genuine concern about military action of the recent past and the understandable instinct at a time of austerity, it will lead to publics and public opinion preventing good politicians of both the centre-left and the centre-right from taking action. So I believe, and finally, that the stakes are high on this. Time is short, and we can no longer ignore the sentiment of the public, but we have to engage in a way that is positive about our role in the world, has a clear vision of European states' role in the world, and in a way that honours the public sentiment and takes them with us. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jim Murphy, for this very interesting speech that really brought another perspective to our topic today. We have little time, but I'd like to take 3 questions as before. One is there. Yeah, maybe you just come back to the... Sorry, could you just raise your hand again? Okay, could somebody bring over a microphone to that gentleman over there? Thank you.
My name is Christian Holters. I'm with the German Ministry of Finance. Sir, my question would be this. Can you envisage to see the budget of the British nuclear forces be subject to the vote of a European Budget Committee, a committee from the European Parliament, within the span of the lifetime of anybody present in the audience? Thank you.
Okay, all right, I think you can answer straight away. And then
okay, are there any other questions? Because that question's...
you rather want a little bit of time.
Well, no, that question's got a one-word answer, and it won't take very long.
Yeah, okay, then we collect. And then we can...
Depends, I guess.
We all know the answer.
The politician's answer would be, it depends how old the youngest person in the audience is. But the actual answer is no.
Okay, more questions. That was a very short
And actually,
one.
the actual answer is no, and probably never.
That was
clearer. There's a longer answer.
Okay. Who else? I'll take 2 more questions. Over there. I'll try to come directly.
Mr. Murphy, we've seen in the past with the Falkland Islands a long time ago, but also potentially with the wars and in involvement in Africa, that not all actions that NATO could become involved in have anything to do with Europe, and that not all European members are actually terribly enthusiastic about getting involved in something which has absolutely nothing to do with Europe. I'll go further. Not all European nations are terribly interested in getting involved in things that do have to do with Europe. But that's another story. Can you see a way out of that dichotomy? Or can Britain, for instance, and you and I are both obviously on the same wavelength, can Britain still be free to conduct its own military and foreign policy, its own sovereignty in its areas of interest?
Okay. Okay.
Thank you very much. As this answer might be a little longer, we should nevertheless, though, collect the third question we still have.
It can't be shorter.
It can't be shorter, can it? But anyway, I think nevertheless it would be good to have. We would take another one. Anybody else who would like to join in? Otherwise, there we are. Damien, I give you my microphone. Oh no, that way then.
Mr. Murphy, if I understood you rightly, the Lisbon Treaty, as I understand it, was based on a hope of increased defence spending by EU states and doing more for institutions like the European Defence Agency. Now, your talk very much was based on less spending by European states and maybe doing more the things that the European Defence Agency might do through cooperations between individual EU states, be it the United Kingdom and France or the Nordic Council. Do you think, given that defence might be one of the things that we need to look at if there's a treaty revision in December, as the December European Council might think?
Okay.
Okay, Jim Murphy, please, your answers.
I gave up a year of my life when I was Europe Minister in the United Kingdom to take the Lisbon Treaty through the House of Commons. And I think I enjoy now, 3 years later, I can say I enjoyed the experience. Because the annoying thing, like, and it's for Ireland to decide how Ireland votes, but I'm a Murphy, so my family are from Ireland. And for the Irish then to vote no after I had spent a year of my life, I was on the telephone to all my relatives in Ireland, begging them to vote for it, because I had given up a year of my life, and other reasons. But like the Defence Agency, I think it's got a role on things like procurement, guaranteeing the single market, having genuine competition in an open market, which we don't have at the moment. I don't want to go into it, not least because there's cameras and it's not just German ministers that don't want to get themselves in trouble. I don't want anything lost in translation, even in my mother tongue. So I'll be careful. But there isn't an open market. People talk of an open market, but it's not there. So I think the agency has a role in doing that. I think my worry is, and I wasn't trying to argue that the EDA would fulfill this role. I think it's for those states making cuts, who are members of NATO, members of the EU, to work much closely together. Again, it's an observation. Each country is making its independent decision on defence cuts. And at the end of it, I worry that we'll all have made decisions based upon our history, our expectations of the future, and our budgetary pressures. And my worry is that the mix of the size of the scope, size, and mix of capability at the end of a multitude of independent but relatively haphazard processes will lead to us thinking, how did we let that happen? So I don't think it's the Defence Agency. I think it's largely through NATO that would happen, but it should happen. And there's obviously the opportunity of doing it bilaterally, multilaterally in member states. The first question about there's a reticence to act and this independent foreign and defence policy. I think the Lisbon Treaty I genuinely think the Lisbon Treaty was a good step forward. It was important. It hasn't yet been fulfilled. Some of the streamlining of institutions that we'd been promised hasn't happened. The Commission seems to, again, I'll get myself in trouble here, but parts of the Commission seem to be carrying on regardless, as if the Lisbon Treaty didn't exist and Cathy Ashton's role just wasn't there. But hey, some of these things take time. But your question was, some European countries, some European governments don't want to act on things that have nothing to do with Europe. Metaphorically, I wanted to scratch my head What issue in the world doesn't affect Europe? If someone wants to shout and tell me what it is, I'll happily be heckled. I don't know what it is. And piracy affects us. The situation in the Middle East affects us. Climate change affects us. The threats of determined people, malevolent groups of violent individuals acquiring the capability on cyber or nuclear or chemical, all of that affects us. There isn't an issue that doesn't affect Europe. It's what we choose to do and how we choose to do it should be the question. So I'll finish by saying this, is that there are more than different nuances on this. I think when I was Europe Minister, we always talked about we have a slightly different tone or a slightly different nuance. I think on this issue of foreign and defence policy, there's a different way of looking at it in different countries. And whatever process comes out after any treaties as a consequence of the Eurozone difficulty, I think foreign and defence policy will remain a matter for better and deeper cooperation, but for the nation states to decide. And the best example for us, and it's not an example, is that there's a part of the world called the Falklands. And while we don't have an empire minister, we have a responsibility. And we, therefore, not just for that reason, absolutely not just for that reason, but importantly for it, we defend the right of every country to have the preference to act through international institutions, but the right, if they are alone, to act in a way that's in their national interest. And I think that will be retained. Thank you.